On April 15th, 2018, a 56-year-old woman named Yoshika Yasutake began dusting a piano inside of her family's very small and very clean home in the English village of Helmsley. Like she always did, after dusting the outside of this piano, Yoshika lifted up the lid and began individually dusting each of the piano keys. But as she did this, she was very careful not to press down accidentally on any of the keys and make a sound. That was the last thing she wanted to do. Every time Yoshika was in charge of cleaning the house, she always dreaded getting to the piano because she was so worried about making a sound. After Yoshika had finished dusting this piano, both outside and inside, she lowered the lid and then walked over to a bookcase right next to a window and began dusting each of the books. And as she did, she began to hear out the window the sounds of birds chirping and cars driving around and people chatting. And Yoshika, when she heard this, she stopped dusting for a moment and just looked out the window at the beautiful town, all the little stone cottages that lined the road. And as she looked out there and listened to the sounds of her village, Yoshika was struck with a sadness about all the things that she was missing out on. Once, Yoshika had been a world-class pianist. She had trained at the Royal College of Music, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in London, and she used to play packed symphony halls where sometimes in the audience would be literal members of the royal family. I mean, she was a really big deal. But Yoshika didn't play the piano anymore because her younger sister, Rina, had come back home. Now, as soon as Yoshika thought of Rina, she got angry and instinctively just turned and stared at Rina's closed bedroom door. And just for a moment, Yoshika wished that Rina had not come home. Because ever since Rina had come home, it was like all of Yoshika's family had decided that nothing else was important. Rina was the only thing that mattered. The Yasutake family consisted of Yoshika, as well as, of course, Rina, who was 49 years old, and they both had a brother who was 51 years old, and his name was Takahiro, and the three siblings' mother also lived with them, and she was 80 years old. As for their dad, he had passed away a few years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were both very impressive in their own ways. Yoshika had been this amazing pianist, and Takahiro was this amazing writer, but Rina was just on another level. Rina not only spoke fluent Greek, Latin, English, and Japanese, but she also created her own dialect of Japanese with a complete system of grammar. Rina was also this unbelievable artist, and everybody wanted to buy her paintings, but Rina would never sell, or if she did, it was quite rare, but that only created lots of hype around her artwork. It was like so valuable to get your hands on one of Rina's paintings. As a child, Rina had been awarded all these scholarships to all these prestigious private schools, and then after graduating high school, she was given a full-ride scholarship to the University of Cambridge, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And so everybody assumed Rina was on track to become this world-famous artist. But there was something dark inside of Rina that no one could quite place. It only came out when she would have these sudden outbursts of anger, and people would see this side of her that just didn't line up with the rest of who she was. But these flashes of anger would often pass quickly, and so people kind of wrote it off as a byproduct of extreme genius. It was like her brain just sometimes couldn't quite handle how smart she was, and she would get mad and frustrated. But when Rina graduated from the University of Cambridge and came back home, she just was totally different. It was like something inside of her had snapped and stayed broken. A couple of days after Rina had come home, she had one of those sudden outbursts of anger, but Rina's anger never went away. She just stayed mad for days and days, and her family began asking her, like, what has gotten you so upset? But Rina refused to talk about it. And eventually, Rina just locked herself in her bedroom in the family home, and she would stay inside of there, refusing to talk to her family for weeks. And then when she did finally emerge after several weeks, it was clear Rina was just different. She basically refused to speak to anyone, family included, unless it was absolutely necessary, and she really never left the house or even her room unless it was totally necessary. And it would turn out this was not some post-college phase Rina was going through. This would become Rina's life. She basically became a total recluse inside of that bedroom for decades, to the point where the family's neighbors didn't even know Rina existed because she basically never came out of the house. Yoshika stopped staring at her sister's closed bedroom door and turned her attention back to the books on the shelf. She finished dusting them, and then after she was done cleaning the house. And so she put the duster down, and Yoshika very quietly tiptoed her way over to Rina's closed bedroom door, and very quietly she knocked. Rina hated loud noises, which is why Yoshika was no longer allowed to play the piano, because it was too loud for Rina. After Yoshika gave this light knock, she began counting in her head to 30 because Rina had told her, you do not come in right away. You knock and you wait 30 seconds at least, and then maybe I'll let you come inside. And so Yoshika, she's counting in her head, 1, 2, 3, she gets to 25, 26, 27, and then from inside the room, Rina would tell Yoshika, okay, you're allowed to enter. Yoshika very slowly reached down, she turned the knob and opened up her sister's bedroom door, and it revealed this totally dark room, this very small, cramped space. All the shades and blinds had been drawn, and Rina was sitting on her bed, completely silent. And Yoshika, she kept her head down, being very careful not to make eye contact with Rina. She didn't want to upset her. And Yoshika, she walked into the room, she made her way to the table, and she scooped up all of Rina's dirty dishes. And then Yoshika, she turned around and began walking out again. And as she did, she tried to take a quick glimpse at whatever Rina was working on in her bedroom, because Rina had told her family that she was working on this master work, but wouldn't really elaborate on it. And in order to work on this thing, she needed the room to be dark and the house to be silent, and she needed to focus exclusively on this master work, and the family needed to support her as she did this. But again, Rina just never really elaborated on what this masterwork was. She would just say that it was very special, and it would combine all the elements of her life, her spirit, her body, her soul. Even the family would be a part of building this masterwork. And when her family asked her, well, what do you mean? How can we support you in making this masterwork? Rina would just say, oh, you'll know when the time is right. Yoshika couldn't get a glimpse of the masterwork, and so she quickly turned her head back down to the ground and shuffled her way out of Rina's room and shut the door behind her. And then Yoshika, she went to the kitchen and she dumped Rina's dishes in the sink, which was totally clean to begin with, because one of Rina's rules was the house must always be immaculately clean, no dirty dish, no dust anywhere. I mean, it had to be perfect, spotless at all times, because that's the only way Rina could work on this masterwork. And so as Yoshika cleaned and dried off all of Rina's dishes and began putting them away, her brother Takahiro walked into the kitchen, and he would say to Yoshika that it was time for them to leave the house and go to the market and buy some supplies for Rina so she can continue to work on this master work. Yoshika was immediately totally annoyed that they had to go do this because everything was all about Rina, but she kind of buried those feelings and told her brother, okay, sure, let's go. Takahiro was different than Yoshika in how he thought about their younger sister, Rina. Yoshika totally resented Rina because now that Rina was home, Yoshika basically had to give up her career as this amazing pianist in order to support Rina in this whole master work she was working on. But Takahiro, he was totally fine giving up his writing career to just focus on supporting Rina, because he really believed in Rina, and he thought that this master work she was building was going to be like the single greatest piece of art in the history of humankind. And so Takahiro felt proud to kind of be a part of it. Now, Takahiro, like the rest of his family, had no idea what this master work actually was, but Takahiro and Rina had a much better relationship than Yoshika and Rina, and so Rina would tell Takahiro the specific things that she needed in order to build this master work. And so that day, Rina had told Takahiro some things she needed, and so he and Yoshika were going to go out and get them. So Takahiro and Yoshika threw on their jackets and stepped outside, and as soon as they were out there, they both flipped their collars up and kind of concealed their faces and put their heads down because they were very careful not to make eye contact with other people. This family was already very private, but with Rina, they had been instructed to be even more private and not even really interact with the outside world. And so basically, anytime they went out in public, they would kind of hide themselves. And so Yoshika and Takahiro, they made their way to the pharmacy, they ducked their way inside, and they would purchase a bottle of surgical spirits, which is sort of like a medical alcohol. And then after buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up, headed back outside, and they went to an old used bookstore, and they bought a book on palm reading, which is the art of studying the lines on your hands in order to tell someone's future. And when the brother and sister bought this book, even though the cashier was talking to them, they kept their heads down and didn't say a word to the cashier. And then after getting their book, the brother and sister hurried their way back home. And when they got there, the door was locked. But instead of pulling out a key and unlocking the door of their own home, the brother and sister knocked and they waited. And then at some point, their mother came to the door and they heard 4 locks turning. The door opened up. And then Yoshika and Takahiro walked inside and they shut the door and then locked again the 4 deadbolts. Rina was adamant that no one in the family could carry around a key to the house. It was too dangerous because they could potentially lose the key in town, and then someone could come into their house and potentially see Rina's master work, and they couldn't have that happen. And so nobody had keys. They had to knock each time they came home. And the reason they had 4 locks on the door was, again, because Rina was very worried about somebody coming into this house and seeing what she was doing. Yoshika carried the bag with the supplies inside of it, the surgical spirits and the palm reading book, over to Rina's closed bedroom door, and instead of knocking, Yoshika just placed the bag right outside the door. She turned around and began walking away, and then as she did, she heard the sound of Rina's door opening just a crack, and Yoshika, she quickly turned around, and she saw a tiny, skinny arm reach out from behind the door. It grabbed the bag and then pulled the bag back into the room, and the door shut and locked. Three days later, on April 18th, 2018, Yoshika was sitting in the kitchen reading a book when she overheard her brother, Takahiro, chatting with Rina. Now, Takahiro and Rina were not facing each other in the same room talking. Rina was still in her bedroom, her door was closed, and Takahiro was outside of her bedroom, and he was just sitting on the ground with his back to the door, talking through the door to Rina. Now, this was not unusual because unlike Yoshika and Rina, who did not have a good relationship and who really didn't talk at all, Takahiro and Rina did have a good relationship, and they would do this fairly often. They would chat through the door for like hours at a time. And so for a minute, Yoshika kind of ignored her brother and sister chatting and focused again on her book. But at some point, she began hearing what her brother was saying, and it was just totally weird. And so she put her book down and just began listening to Takahiro. And what he was saying was, how can you do that? That doesn't make any sense. How? Only your soul? How? Yoshika sensed that her brother was confused and maybe upset about something, and so she couldn't help herself. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room and looked down at her brother to see if he would kind of give her some indication of what was going on. But when Takahiro looked up and saw Yoshika, he and Rina stopped talking, and Takahiro just shook his head, stood up, and walked away. After Takahiro was gone, Yoshika very quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door, and just out of curiosity, she pressed her ear up against the wood and tried to listen to see if she could maybe hear Rina and catch something she was saying that would begin to explain what she had just overheard. But all she heard was the sound of Rina slowly shuffling towards the back of her bedroom where her bed was, and then it was totally silent. And so Yoshika moved away from the door and went back into the kitchen, and she sat down to read again, but she couldn't focus on the book because it was like this wave of sadness was just coming over her. And the reason Yoshika was feeling this way is she was thinking about the fact that back in the day when she was a kid, her and Rina used to be as close as sisters could possibly be, and for much of their lives, they were very close. Even after Rina began this kind of reclusive lifestyle, they still, were friends, they interacted. But something happened in 2013, 5 years earlier, that totally severed their relationship for good. On that day, Rina had emerged from her bedroom, and Yoshika offered to read Rina's palm. This was something the two sisters did for each other periodically. It was like a way for them to bond. And so Rina held out her hand, and Yoshika took it, and she began tracing a long horizontal line across her palm. Now, Rina's hands were different than most people's hands. Rina had something called a simian line, which is a very rare thing on people's palms. It's like this long horizontal line that runs the length of your hand. In palm reading, a simian line can be either very good or very bad. It can indicate that the person is a visionary or a mystic, so that's the good side, or it can indicate that this person has a terrible disease or they're very aggressive, so that's the bad side. Rina knew she had the simian line, and she believed that it represented something good. She would say that she had a visionary soul. But on this particular day in 2013, the family had recently been banned from a local supermarket because Rena had actually gone to this market and gotten really upset with some staff members and totally lost her cool and screamed and yelled at them, and so they had been banned. And so Yoshika, thinking about this, she's looking at Rena's palm and she goes, "Oh, the simian line. Maybe this is why you were acting so aggressive at the supermarket. Maybe this means you're an aggressive person." But after Yoshika said this, Rena was so offended that she whipped her hand back and began screaming and yelling at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, "You don't understand the vision that I have. I'm gonna show the world someday this vision, and you and those idiots down at the grocery store would never understand." And then Rena began beating and punching and kicking Yoshika, and Yoshika's screaming and trying to protect herself, and then Takahiro, the brother, had to run in and separate the two of them. Now, even though Rena was prone to these angry outbursts, this was the first time that she had lashed out physically, and so Rena's mother was concerned that Rena had some underlying condition that was causing her to lash out physically, and so she sent Rena to the doctor, and the doctor would say, there is no underlying condition that led to this. However, it seems pretty clear that Rena is having some kind of psychological breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment, maybe even hospitalization. But Rena had totally rejected this, refused to get treatment, and blamed everything on Yoshika. And then after that, Rena really stopped leaving her bedroom. She left like once every couple of months before that, but now she basically stayed in there 24/7. And at the same time, Rena had added all these new rules that her family now needed to follow to allow Rena to be able to focus on her master work while she was in her bedroom. And that included no one having house keys and adding those 4 locks to the door. Also, the family was told to learn the new dialect of Japanese that Rena had created. This way, no one would ever understand what they were talking about. It would kind of protect them even more from the evils of the outside world. Also, Rena made sure her family got rid of all of their telephones, their TVs, and their computers. And so Yoshika would sit in the kitchen for a bit longer, thinking about how sad it was that she had lost this relationship with her sister. And, Yoshika had a lot of regret about what she had said about the simian line. But eventually, like always, Yoshika just kind of pushed her feelings for Rena down. And before long, Yoshika was back to reading her book. For the next several weeks, Yoshika would see her brother, Takahiro, sitting up against the door to Rena's bedroom more often than usual, having these kind of hushed conversations through the door with Rena. Also, Yoshika began to notice that Takahiro was now cooking all of Rena's meals. Normally, their mother was the one who cooked Rena's food, but now Takahiro seemed to have taken over that task entirely. As for Yoshika, because she was primarily in charge of being the one to constantly clean the house, that meant she was the one going into Rena's bedroom and collecting her dirty dishes. And as soon as Takahiro had begun being the cook for Rena, Yoshika began to notice that more and more food was being left on Rena's plates. Basically, Rena wasn't eating as much food as she normally did, and this started to worry Yoshika. Rena was already a very small person. She was 4 foot 11 inches tall, barely 90 pounds. And Yoshika worried that, she really needs to eat. She's already so small, she can't afford to miss meals. And then one day in the middle of May, Yoshika went into Rena's bedroom and she saw all of her dishes were basically completely filled with the food she had been given. She basically had not touched them. And Yoshika, she really never actually spoke to Rena when she was in the bedroom. But this time she just couldn't help herself. And without even looking at Rena, Yoshika, she gathered up the plates full of food and she said, "Rena, you need to eat more of your food." Rena didn't say anything back. And Yoshika, she just quickly turned and walked out of the room. But after that interaction, Takahiro would tell Yoshika that Rena doesn't want you going in her room ever again. And so from now on, the dishes that you would normally collect, Rena will place them right outside of the door. That way, you don't have to go inside that room. Also, around the same time, Rena, who normally would only leave her bedroom to go use the bathroom, well, she began going to the bathroom exclusively at night when her family was asleep to avoid any interaction with them. And so by this point, Rena's interactions with her family were reduced to basically zero. By early August, Takahiro and Yoshika were being sent to the store more and more often by Rena to get more of these surgical spirits, the medical alcohol. Now, neither Takahiro nor Yoshika had any idea what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they knew it was their duty to support her, and so they kept buying them, and what they would do is they would come back home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door, and he would tuck the bottle inside, and then Rina would take it, the door would shut, and then Rina would never give them her empty bottle. Basically, the bottle went in, and it stayed inside. Then, on August 18th of 2018, Takahiro and Rina appeared to get in some kind of a fight. Yoshika was in the kitchen, and she saw that Takahiro was sitting against the door of Rina's bedroom, and the two were having kind of a hushed conversation. And then at some point, Takahiro stood up, and he turned around and faced the door and kind of yelled into it, "I told you your soul was not enough." And then Rina said something back to him, at which point Takahiro said, "No, please, please," as if he was kind of begging with Rina to change her mind. And then before Yoshika could come over and ask Takahiro what was going on, Takahiro just opened up Rina's bedroom door and walked inside, and suddenly the house went completely silent. Yoshika was too nervous to walk over and look inside of the room, and so she just stayed in the kitchen and listened. And for 15 minutes, it was absolute silence. And then Takahiro walked out of Rina's bedroom, shut the door behind him, and he looked very calm. And at this point, Yoshika looked over at him and said, "What's going on?" And Takahiro, he would just smile and tell Yoshika that Rina's masterwork is nearly completed. And then Takahiro asked Yoshika if she remembered when Rina had said, at some point her masterwork was going to require some direct help from the family, but she said, we'll know when the time is right for us to participate. And Yoshika would say, yes, I remember that. And Takahiro said, well, the time is now. Then Takahiro told Yoshika that they had to go to the store and get more surgical spirits. And so really without questioning him, Yoshika went with him. They went to the store and they would purchase 3 times the normal amount of surgical spirits that they normally would. And then when they got home, Takahiro alone would go into Rina's bedroom with these surgical spirits. He would shut the door behind him, and Yoshika just sat in the kitchen for about 10 minutes until Takahiro came out again, no longer carrying these surgical spirits. And he would come over to Yoshika and he would say, "Rina is ready to reconcile with you. She wants you to sit by the door and talk to her. And if you do that, you can be more involved in creating her masterwork." And at this news, Yoshika felt a mixture of frustration and relief. She had never thought it was fair that Rina had so completely cut her off after that 2013 Simian line joke she made while palm reading. Also, Rina had made Yoshika's life so difficult for so long. I mean, Yoshika had basically been forced to give up her dreams of playing the piano, and she had to give up her friends and all of her life ambitions and goals to just support Rina. But despite all of that, deep down, Yoshika missed Rina terribly. They did used to be so close. She wanted to have that relationship again. And so Yoshika walked over to Rina's closed bedroom door. She sat down against it, and at first, she didn't say anything, and Rina didn't say anything either. But then at some point, it was like the floodgates just opened, and Yoshika kind of began pouring her heart out about how sad she was, about how her and Rina's relationship had really gone south and how she wanted to fix it. And now normally, on the rare times that Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it up to drop something off or whatever it was, oftentimes Rina would just start banging on something inside of the room, kind of to tell Yoshika to stop talking and go away. But as Yoshika sat there pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, the one thing Yoshika noticed was there was no pounding coming from inside the room. Rina was listening to her. And then the next day, after Yoshika and Takahiro had gone to the store again and gotten more surgical spirits and brought them back to the house, instead of just Takahiro being allowed to enter Rina's bedroom, this time Yoshika was allowed to join. And so Takahiro and Yoshika, they went into the dark bedroom and Rina was laying on the bed, and they walked over to her and Takahiro showed Yoshika what they needed to do. It was the last step of this masterwork project that Rina was working on. They basically needed to rub these surgical spirits all over Rina's body. Now, Yoshika didn't really understand why they were doing this, but she respected that this was part of Rina's plan, and frankly, Yoshika was just happy to be included in creating this masterwork, and so she didn't really ask any questions. And so after the brother and sister had rubbed this alcohol all over Rina for about 10 minutes, they walked back outside, they shut the door, and then Yoshika, she stayed back and sat down against the door and kind of poured her heart out again to Rina. And it was just very therapeutic. And in many ways, this was the first time that Yoshika was feeling happy again. I mean, she was finally starting to repair this relationship with Rina. And so over the next several weeks, this became Yoshika's new daily routine. Her and her brother would get all these surgical spirits, they'd come home, they'd rub them all over Rina, and then over the course of the day, Yoshika would stop by the door and chat with Rina through it, and that was it. And then on September 25th, 2018, after Yoshika and Takahiro had applied these surgical spirits to Rina's body, Yoshika told Rina that she had a very special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a really good mood this day because one, she was feeling really good about her new relationship with her sister, but also two, when she had gone to the pharmacy earlier with her brother, normally they didn't have any interaction with the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits, mostly because Yoshika and her brother did their best to kind of like hide themselves and make it very clear they were not looking to talk. But on this particular day, the pharmacist had been very talkative and was trying to talk to Yoshika, and Yoshika, she decided she would talk back. Now, their conversation was not very substantive. Basically, the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, why are you buying all these surgical spirits? And Yoshika would say, oh, they're for my sister Rina, and, she needs more and more of them every day, and, she's working on something special, and we don't really know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know whatever she's doing, it's going to be worth it. And so even though this conversation seems kind of meaningless, for Yoshika, who had virtually no contact with other people, it was great having that little talk. And so when she came home, she just felt ready to do something special for Rina. And so after Yoshika and Takahiro had left Rina's bedroom after applying these surgical spirits, Yoshika went to go give Rina her surprise. And so Yoshika, she walked over to the family piano that was not far from Rina's bedroom door. And Yoshika, she was nervous, but she sat down on the bench and she opened up the lid and she placed her fingers on the keys. Yoshika's big surprise was she was going to play a song called The Waltz of the Flowers, which is a famous piece of classical music that was inspired by the composer's love for his sister. And so Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to finally play in this house for Rina. She'll see that I love her so much. And so Yoshika, she began to play the song, and as she did, she was constantly listening to see if Rina would start banging on something to tell Yoshika to stop. But again, she didn't. It was quiet, and so Yoshika, she played this beautiful song, and then when it was all over, again, Yoshika's listening carefully for Rina to yell out or be mad that she's playing this loud music in the house, but it was just quiet. And so again, Yoshika just felt this closeness to her sister, and before long, Yoshika felt tears of happiness coming down her cheeks. But then, as Yoshika closed the lid of the piano, she did hear a banging, but it wasn't coming from Rina's bedroom, it was coming from the front door. And then a moment later, Yoshika heard someone scream from outside the front door, "Police, open up!" But before Yoshika could go to the door to open it, her mother had ran to the door, she opened all 4 locks, but then only opened it a crack and tried to yell at the police to go away, go away. But the police, they were kind of pushing on the door, trying to get the mother to get out of the way. And Yoshika, she kind of moved over and looked through the crack. And she saw it wasn't just a couple of police officers. It was a whole army of police officers and firefighters and EMTs. There was an ambulance. And then before long, the police officer that had been yelling, open up, he finally just pushed and got the door open all the way. And then a swarm of people in uniforms flooded the home. And as soon as all these officers were in the house, they immediately began opening up every door like they were looking for something. And then finally they got to Rina's bedroom and they opened the door. And as soon as they did, Yoshika watched as the officers just stopped at the doorway and they began cussing and yelling and turning their faces away. And then the officers went into Rina's bedroom, and then a minute later they began talking on their radio, and then EMTs came into the house with a stretcher. They went into Rina's bedroom, and then before long, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched as the stretcher came out again with these officers and EMTs, and on the stretcher was Rina, and she looked terrible. Her eyes were sunken back in her head, and her skin was so pale it was practically see-through. I mean, really, she just kind of looked like a skeleton. The real story of what happened inside of that family's home would quickly become international news. And not because Rina was secretly creating a masterwork of art in her bedroom. Here's what really happened. Rena stopped eating food in April of 2018. She would say that the only thing she needed to be nourished was her visionary soul. And so basically, because she had this visionary soul, she didn't need food. That was the conversation that Yoshika had overheard between Takahiro and Rena when Takahiro was saying, "Only your soul? How? Well, he was trying to figure out how Rena was going to survive by being nourished by her soul. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward 4 months to August 18th, and again, Yoshika had overheard her brother and her sister talking through the bedroom door, except on this day, it sounded like Takahiro was fighting with Rena, because at some point he had stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul wasn't enough!" And then he had busted inside of Rena's bedroom and stayed in there in silence for 15 minutes, only to come back out again and very calmly tell Yoshika that, "Don't worry, Rena is nearing the end of her master work, and we just need to go out and get her more surgical spirits." Well, it would turn out the reason Takahiro was mad and yelled through the door at Rena is because he was trying to talk to her through the door and she wasn't talking back. And he suspected it was because she wasn't eating, and so he had yelled at her about that and then barged into her room only to find Rena totally unresponsive, not moving, not talking, nothing. And so he just stood there wondering what to do. And so as Takahiro is standing there, it clicks for him that now is the time. Now's the time to get involved. And so Takahiro left the bedroom, he grabbed Yoshika, they went to the pharmacy, they got more surgical spirits, they came back, and Takahiro alone went into Rena's bedroom and covered her head to toe in these spirits, because that was something she had wanted him to do before, and he believed that that's what she needed right now, because she can't talk, she can't move, she needs more of these spirits. That's going to help her visionary soul nourish her while she completes this master work. And for the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika would continue to apply these spirits to Rena's body, believing they were helping her complete her master work. On September 25th, when Yoshika and Takahiro were at the pharmacy getting more spirits, the reason this pharmacist finally struck up a conversation with Yoshika is because over time, the pharmacist had noticed that every time they came in to buy these surgical spirits, they smelled so bad. And on this particular day, when they came in, the stench was just overwhelming. And so the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, what are these surgical spirits for? And Yoshika would give this totally weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister and she was working on this master work in her bedroom and it was all going to be worth it. And so when Yoshika and Takahiro had left that day, the pharmacist was just so weirded out and alarmed by them that he called the police. And when the police arrived at the family's home, they discovered that Rena was not building a masterwork in her bedroom, she was just dead in her bed, and had been for 6 weeks. Rena died around August 18th, which is the day that Takahiro came into the room and discovered her unresponsive, which meant there was never any reconciliation happening between Yoshika and Rena. It's unclear why Takahiro had told Yoshika, hey, Rena's ready to reconcile with you, because again, Rena was dead at the time, so there's no way she would have said anything to him. And so when Yoshika was having these supposed heart-to-hearts through the door with her sister or playing music for her, that wasn't real. The only real thing that was happening is Yoshika and Takahiro, from August 18th until the end of September when the police busted into their home, they would spend nearly every day rubbing this weird medical alcohol all over their dead sister's body because that's what they believed she wanted, when in reality, all this alcohol was doing was actually mummifying her body. Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother were all charged with preventing a proper and decent burial. As for Rena, her cause of death could not actually be determined, but based on what she looked like, they assumed she died from starvation. The court would eventually drop the charges against the family, saying that basically the family was too mentally ill to stand trial, and this was because the court had discovered that Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother actually had not accepted that Rena was dead. They believed she was actually still alive, that all the work they had done rubbing those spirits on her had nourished her soul, and she was still working on this master work. And as of a few years ago, the family is still living in that same cottage, and it's not clear if they ever actually came to understand that Rena was in fact dead. Located on the far northern tip of Maine, right on the border of Canada, lies a small rural town called Van Buren. Van Buren is home to about 2,000 people who, for the most part, have lived in Maine for their entire lives, and they tend to be very rugged and very competent people. But unless you live in Van Buren or know someone in Van Buren or have family out there, there's no reason you would have heard of this particular town. Nothing really happens in this town, at least nothing that makes headlines. However, that would change. In 2019, Van Buren made international headlines because of one man, Ronald Sear. As a young man in the 1950s, Ronald Sear joined the Air Force and fought in the Korean War. And then after he got out of the military, he moved back to his hometown of Van Buren, Maine, and he moved into a very modest 2-story home right near town. And for a little while, he just kind of floated about, didn't really have a direction in life. But eventually, because of his love for working with his hands and his general skill at working with his hands and building things, he started a small but successful tool selling company that he ran right out of his shed on his property. Fast forward to 2019, Ronald Sear at that time was 65 years old, and he still lived in the same property right near town in Van Buren. However, he now lived alone, and he still ran this tool selling business right out of his work shed. And for Ronald, this was enough. He was very content with his life. He was very happy. But that year, he would face a crisis. One bright, sunny morning in the summer of that year, Ronald left his house and he walked over to his shed. He went inside, and right away he noticed something. Ronald kept all these bins inside of his shed that were full of all of the different tools that he would sell. And because he was in there all the time, either literally selling tools or tinkering with whatever it was he was building himself, he was very aware of how full each of these bins were. And anytime they got low, he would order more so he had enough supply to sell. And so he went into his shed this morning and he noticed right away that a couple of the bins appeared to be a little bit lower than he remembered. And right away, Ronald is thinking, did I forget to order supplies to fill these bins up? Did I just forget to do that? But he's thinking to himself, I am meticulous in making sure my inventory is full at all times. I've been doing this for decades, and so it can't be me. Maybe I took the tools and I brought them into my house and I've left them in there, or maybe they're in my truck. And so Ronald, believing there's a totally logical explanation for this, would leave his shed and he would search his property, but he can't find these tools anywhere. And so he began calling his family and his friends to see if, maybe they had come by and borrowed some of these tools, or maybe they knew what had happened to them. But everyone he spoke to said, no, I have no idea. And so by that afternoon, Ronald had found himself back inside of his work shed looking around, thinking to himself, have I been robbed? It was the only logical thing he could think of that would explain this loss. And so Ronald drove to the police station and he spoke to police and he explained what happened. But unfortunately, the police's reaction to what he was telling them was not exactly what he wanted. They basically assumed that, he just had miscounted, that in reality, the tools were either still in the shed and then he just forgot how many were supposed to be in there, or he had just kind of lost them on his property somewhere, that they were bound to turn up. And so the police told him, look, Ronald, go back and search your property. I'm sure they're there. And if you get some proof that someone actually stole from you, then come back to us. And so Ronald was really annoyed by this. He wanted them to take this seriously, but he could tell they just were not going to. And so Ronald drove back to his house. He went inside, he hopped on his computer, and he began researching what other homeowners did to protect themselves from things like theft. And one of the things he came across was setting up tripwires all around the perimeter of your property. Basically, you take these thin wires and you stretch them out very tight, very low to the ground, and you anchor them on each side, and then on the wire itself, you hang little bells. And so in theory, if an intruder were to walk onto your property, they would most likely not see the tripwires on the ground and they would kick them, and that would cause the bells to ring, thereby alerting the homeowner of their presence. Ronald loved this idea, so he went out and he set up tripwires all around his property. But over the next several days, after these wires were stood up, none of the wires made any sound, and still more tools continued to go missing. This was also in spite of the fact that his shed was locked at night. And so Ronald's thinking to himself, whoever's doing this is clearly watching me and kind of monitoring what I'm doing. They must be aware of the tripwires, and they must be sneaking into the shed, at some time that I have the doors unlocked. I mean, this is a professional thief. And so as Ronald is thinking about this master thief that is targeting him, he has this sudden fear clear that if he can't stop this person from breaking into his shed and taking his tools, how can he possibly protect himself against this person breaking into his home and stealing things from in there, which included all of his cash and many other valuables? And so Ronald became very fearful and decided the only thing he could do was really beef up his home security system. And so he hopped back online and he began Googling other ways to protect your property. And after discovering a number of really effective techniques, he got to work. He began building all these home defense systems and placing them all around his property. And after all of these kind of DIY security measures were put up, the theft of his tools stopped. And in Ronald's mind, that validated that his defense system had worked. He was effectively preventing theft. But this would not be the end of his troubles. Fast forward to Thanksgiving that year, so November 28th, and the Van Buren police got a very frantic phone call from Ronald. He was totally hysterical, he wasn't really making sense, and the police, they tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was that he was requesting police to come to his residence immediately. And so the police, they hang up and they're thinking, okay, we know Ronald was dealing with a potential thief. Maybe he literally caught the thief red-handed and he wants us to come and arrest this person, and who knows, maybe they're fighting at his residence right now. And so the police speed over to Ronald's house, they pull into his driveway, and at first glance, nothing looks out of the ordinary. Ronald's truck is in the driveway, and there's no obvious signs of a disturbance, but they notice the front door to Ronald's house is wide open. And so the police park their cars in Ronald's driveway, they get out and they run up onto the front porch, and they're standing in front of this open door, and they look down and they can see there's a very obvious blood trail starting from the front of Ronald's house, going straight back down a hallway that looped around to the left and out of sight. And so right away, the police are yelling into the house, Ronald, are you okay? What's going on? And somewhere deep inside of the house, they hear what sounds like Ronald make a kind of guttural sound. And so immediately this tips the police that more than likely Ronald has been hurt and he likely is the one who made this blood trail. And so the police draw their guns and they go inside of Ronald's house, not really sure what they're going to find. They don't know if there's some intruder or attacker or someone in here that's harmed Ronald, but they make their way down this hall following the blood trail. They turn the corner, and then sitting at the end of the blood trail is Ronald. He's sitting down with his back to some cabinets in the kitchen and he's clutching his midsection. He is covered in blood. He's completely pale. And so right away, the officers call in backup, but then as a security measure, they search the rest of the first floor to make sure there is no other person here. There was no one on the first floor. They went to the second floor. They peeked around up there. They didn't see anyone. So they rushed back down to Ronald, who's still just sitting there, and they begin administering first aid, and they're trying to get him to explain what happened. How did you get hurt? But Ronald is clearly in shock. He's kind of in a daze. He's not making sense. And then by the time the paramedics showed up, just a couple of minutes later, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. When Ronald was wheeled out of the house, the responding officers and the backup officers, who by now had arrived, decided to search the rest of Ronald's house to see if there was some clue as to what had happened. And so they began searching in the kitchen, looking around, but there wasn't anything that stood out to them. And then they began walking around towards the living room. And when they got into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed to everyone inside to stop where they were, stop moving. It would turn out Ronald, as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property, including inside of his house. And some of these traps were gun booby traps. The officer that had yelled for everyone to stop had spotted one of these traps. He saw a handgun anchored to the ceiling aimed at the front door, and there was a string attached to the trigger that was also then attached to the doorknob of the front door. And so if this trap were live and some person opened the front door, it would activate this trap, causing the gun to shoot them. And so clearly Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap on, and he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself. And so after the officer sees this gun anchored to the ceiling, he tells everyone, and they begin looking up and just looking around to see if there are other traps. And amazingly, there are. In other doorways, just from where they're standing, they can see the barrels of guns pointing down that are obvious booby traps. in their haste to get in there and figure out what was going on, they hadn't noticed all of these guns in the ceiling. And so it was just kind of a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald would be rushed to the hospital that night, but he would pass away from his wound. His death would be ruled an accident, and to this day, we don't know if he really was dealing with a professional thief that was stealing his tools, or if it was just a figment of his imagination. Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, Mary's family barely had enough money to get by. And then by the time Mary was 21, both of her parents had passed away, leaving her with nothing. After their deaths, Mary kind of bounced around Houston, going from one low-paying job to the next, and then eventually she met a man that she fell madly in love with, and they got married, but unfortunately that marriage would end in divorce. After Mary got over that heartbreak, she would meet another man who she would also fall in love with, and they would get married too, but like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was so devastated by yet another heartbreak that she just kind of accepted that she was not gonna get married again. She was not gonna have a family of her own. But she didn't let this get her down. Instead, she kind of embraced her life as a loner. Fast forward to 2015, and Mary was 61 years old, and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood. This neighborhood, over the last several decades, had really begun to grow. Lots of new apartment complexes were being built all the time, and in fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary and offered to buy her house so they could build over her land, but she had refused because she loved her house. She did not want to sell it. It didn't matter what they offered her. And so she was the only house in this long stretch of apartment buildings that didn't sell. But Mary kind of liked it. She wrote in her diary that her bungalow was like a castle, and all these apartment buildings all around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't really have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She didn't have much contact, if any, with her living family, and she really didn't have any friends, with the exception of one woman who was in town who owned an arts and crafts shop, who Mary would periodically go into town and say hello to. But despite all that, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats, and she loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat out in the neighborhood, Mary would get the cat food and water, and then eventually would try to coax the cat to come into her house, and then when it did, she would win the cat's trust, and then she would give it a place to live, and she would feed it and take care of it. And so before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. And so these cats kind of became Mary's best friends, and so she rarely left the house, if ever. She mostly just stayed in the house with them. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property, and they looked over and they saw a stack of mail had grown on her front porch, indicating that Mary had not opened her door to get her mail. And this neighbor also noticed that while Mary's property did tend to get a little bit overgrown with the trees and the grass, it was exceptionally overgrown, like no one was even trying to take care of it. And so this neighbor was concerned that maybe something had happened to Mary, and so they opened up her fence, they walked across the yard, they went up onto the porch, and they knocked on the front door, but it was silent. And so this neighbor kind of leaned over and looked in the window that was just to the left of the door to see if maybe they could look inside, but there was a curtain drawn across that window, so they couldn't see anything. And so the neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, but again, met with silence. And so after standing there for a minute, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house to see if maybe they could look in one of those windows, but when they went around to the side, those windows were covered with curtains too. So the neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there looking at the house, wondering what they should do. And something told them that something's off, something's wrong, someone needs to make sure Mary really is okay. Someone needs to get inside of this house. And so the neighbor called the Houston police and explained the situation. A few minutes later, the Houston police arrived, and they too went right up onto Mary's porch. They knocked on her door. It was met with silence. And so after that, the police talked to one of the other neighbors and got a key that Mary had apparently given them previously. And the police went back to Mary's front door. They used the key. They unlocked the door. They opened it up, and right away they were hit with this horrible smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open, and they stepped inside and they yelled out for Mary, but it was silent. And then before the police even began walking around looking for her, they looked off to their left and the right inside of the house, and they saw there were all these dead cats all over the ground. And so the Houston police didn't know what happened to Mary, but right away they're thinking, okay, we've seen scenarios like this before where someone who lives alone that no one really checks on dies unexpectedly, and then when they pass away, all of their pets are trapped in the house, they're not getting fed, and so they pass away too. And so the police at this point are fully expecting to find Mary's dead body somewhere in the house, and so they begin walking through the house looking for it. But after searching the house top to bottom, they could not find Mary. And so the police leave Mary's house, and at this point there are people outside gathered because they see the police cars. And so the police grabbed a couple of the neighbors and they asked them, do you know anything about this woman? Did she say anything about where she was going? Did you see her leave at any point? And the consensus amongst the neighbors they spoke to was that Mary basically kept to herself. She did not travel. She didn't go anywhere. She mostly just stayed in her house with her cats. And so it was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned the property and abandoned her cats because she loved them so much. And so the police at this point are thinking, okay, she's got to be in this house somewhere. And so the police called a few more officers to the property, and the group went back inside of Mary's house, and they really looked for Mary, thinking that, maybe she slipped into a closet and that's where she passed away, or, maybe she's just hidden somewhere in the house. And so they really kind of ripped the house apart looking for her. But again, there was just nothing. And so after they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police contacted Mary's extended family and they asked them the same questions. Did Mary say anything about a trip she was going to take? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? And they all would say, look, we don't talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have no idea. And so for a little while, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around Houston. But eventually, after finding nothing, the search kind of stopped, and they reached out to Mary's family and said, if you hear anything else about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, Mary's house went into foreclosure because no one was making the payments anymore, and the bank put her house up for auction. And a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought the house up quickly, and after cleaning it out, he put it on the market to be rented out. And for the next couple of years, several tenants lived in Mary's old house, none of them staying for very long. Then in March of 2017, when the property was vacant, this young couple reached out to the landlord and said they were looking to rent, and they were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled, and he sent over a lease for them to sign. And then once the couple had signed the lease and the property was theirs, the husband decided to just go over on his own and walk around the property and see what they would need to buy in terms of furnishings. And so the husband arrives at the property, he goes in the front door, he walks around the first floor, and then at some point he decides he wants to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they have. And so he gets underneath the trap door in the ceiling, he grabs the string and he pulls it down, revealing this folded up ladder. He flips down the lower ladder piece and puts it on the ground, and then he began climbing up. Once he got up into the attic, he stayed standing on the ladder and just kind of scanned around, and he saw there really wasn't much up there. There was a couple of metal cages that appeared to have been for pets or something, but it was very dirty and dark, and it appeared like no one had really come up here in a long time. And he kind of assumed that, the other tenants weren't using this as a storage space. And so the husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof begins to pitch down, he saw one of the floorboards was kind of popped up like it shouldn't be. And he stared at it, and he's looking around at the rest of the attic, and all of the floorboards were perfectly uniform, but that one was really jacked up. And so he was curious, and so he climbed up into the attic, and he kind of stooped down, and he walked over to this loose floorboard, and when he was standing over it, he could tell that this floorboard had kind of popped off of this hole in the ground, that the floorboard had been covering this hole, but the hole was dark. And so he pulled out his phone, and he turned on his flashlight, and he looked straight down, and he aimed the light into this hole. Now, this hole was basically just a gap between two of the walls on the first floor. And so he's shining his light down into this gap, and he sees at the bottom the remains of the woman the Houston police have been looking for the past 2 years. Mary Cerruti. While no one knows for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed back in early 2015 when she went missing, she had gone up into the attic where perhaps her cats liked to sunbathe off to the side of the attic because there was a big window that looked into the attic. And so she went up there to maybe feed the cats or check on the cats that were up there. And when she walked over to that side of the attic where the window looked in, she stepped on that loose floorboard and it gave out from her weight and she kind of fell through it like a trap door and fell down into that gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was hurt from this fall, but when she stood back up again in this kind of narrow space, she would have realized very quickly that there was nowhere for her to go. You can't go left, you can't go right, and you can't get back up into the attic. It was too far up for her to reach, and there was no way for her to kind of use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow. I mean, she could barely move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call anyone. If she screamed out, no one would have heard her because she was behind several walls of insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one that was just going to find her trapped in the wall. She was totally on her own. And so trapped in this little space, Mary spent probably a couple of days screaming and trying to get her way out, but nothing worked. And then eventually she passed away. And then unfortunately, all of her cats did too. Her death was ruled an accident. In the spring of 2017, Antonio Navarrete was on top of the world. Just a year earlier, the 21-year-old Florida resident had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez. And now Daisy was pregnant, and so she and Antonio were very excited about starting a family together. For the time being, Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents in his hometown of Waimama, which is a quiet rural suburb just south of Tampa. But Antonio had a bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated high school, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic, and he had the skills to do it. From the time he was a toddler, he had always been obsessed with cars, breaking apart his toy cars and putting them back together. And then as he got a little bit older, he began drawing these very intricate drawings of cars that he loved or designs for new cars. And then when he was a teenager, he began actually tinkering around with real cars until he finally acquired a car of his own. It was a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck that he tricked out with all these fancy lights and special rims and this huge sound system that took up most of his back seat. It was thanks in part to this truck, which he nicknamed Casper, that Antonio, who was too shy to be much of a ladies' man, met up with Daisy in the first place. Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup for other car enthusiasts, where you could basically park your vehicle and you could walk around and see what other people did to upgrade or enhance their vehicles. And so while Antonio was there, he was walking around when he saw on the far side of this meetup, there was this unbelievably beautiful young woman, and he found himself just staring at her. He couldn't help it. And this young woman, who was Daisy, she eventually would look up and she would smile at him, and the rest, as they say, was history. 6 months later, not long after Daisy had moved in with Antonio at his parents' house, and the couple had announced to their delighted families that they were going to have a baby, Antonio got yet another good piece of news. He'd landed a good job with a company that did maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant, which was located in Apollo, Florida, which was about 10 miles to the east of Antonio's parents' home. Now, this was not Antonio's dream job. He still very much wanted to eventually become an auto mechanic, but this job paid $12 an hour, nearly double what he was used to making. And so with this job, he and Daisy would finally be able to raise enough money to get a place of their own, hopefully before the baby arrived that fall. Also, Antonio had been told by other people who worked at this company that this was actually a really easy job, that pretty much you just rolled around on golf carts all day picking up trash. It was perfect. A few weeks later, on June 24th, Antonio found himself driving in his truck to the Big Bend power plant for his first day on the job. As he drove, he would have glanced over at the picture of Daisy he had taped to his dashboard. She was the only woman he had ever loved besides his mother. When Antonio arrived at the Big Bend power plant, he was totally amazed at just how enormous this thing was. It was basically this huge factory that sat right up against the water, and there were 4 huge smokestacks coming out of the ceiling of this factory with white smoke billowing out of them. This plant produced electricity electricity, and they did this by burning coal. This process was done in 4 distinct units that were inside of this factory that Antonio was looking at. And each of these units is comprised of a humongous boiler, which is basically a 12-story tall oven. And so coal is loaded into this huge boiler, and it burns at the bottom of the boiler, creating some steam. And that steam goes up the boiler and begins to turn these huge turbines, creating the electricity. And then the steam just continues up the boiler and then out its respective smokestack into the air. In newer units, the airborne ash, which is a natural byproduct of burning coal, is captured inside of the boiler. But at Big Bend, 3 of their 4 units were built in the 1970s, so they were older models, and they did not capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated up so much that it would melt and turn into a substance called slag, which basically is molten lava, like the stuff that comes out of volcanoes. That's what slag is. And so as this slag kind of builds up inside of the boiler, it would go through this man-sized hole at the very bottom of the boiler, and right below that hole is this 30-foot tall water tank called a cooling tank, and this red-hot slag, it basically dumps down into that water, which cools it off, turning it into these kind of glassy rocks. And then they settle at the bottom of this 30-foot cooling tank, and at the bottom of the cooling tank is this grinding mechanism that pulls these hardened, cooled off little boulders of slag into it, and it crushes them up and spits them out on the other side as little tiny bits of slag chips. And then these chips get sold for use in everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. So after Antonio had spent several minutes just admiring this gargantuan building he would be working in, he gathered up his things, he hopped out of his truck, and he headed toward the front doors. That day, and the next couple of days, were very uneventful for Antonio. He basically just sat in a break room and watched videos about safety and training, and then when he wasn't doing that, he was out trying to navigate around the inside of this huge factory, which was basically this huge maze. And he found very quickly that it was a very hazardous place to work, as there were huge trucks moving around inside of it, it was super loud, and there was just heavy machinery operating constantly all around you. But after several days of just kind of walking around and asking people what things were, Antonio felt like he had a pretty good handle on the layout and also on what his job would entail. On Thursday, June 29th, so just 4 days into doing this new job, Antonio woke up in his parents' house in a really good mood because the next day, that Friday, Daisy was going in for an ultrasound and they were going to find out whether their baby was a boy or a girl, and he was very excited about this. And so Antonio came downstairs, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he kissed Daisy on the cheek, and he headed outside into his truck and began the commute to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was in the grocery store when she pulled her phone out of her purse, and she noticed Antonio had called her and she missed it, but he had left a voicemail. And so she played the voicemail and then put the phone to her ear. And what she heard was quite possibly the most traumatic thing a mother could ever hear from their child. After leaving the house that morning, Antonio drove all the way to work, no problem. He parked in the lot, he went inside the building, and initially the day was like any other day. He just kind of drove around the facility and picked up trash, and that was it. But just a couple of hours into his shift, 2 fairly significant issues arose simultaneously inside of Unit 2. In the boiler, the slag that was building up had somehow created a sort of plug over that man-sized hole where the slag was supposed to dump into the water chamber. And so as more and more slag was being created as the ash melted, it wasn't draining into that chamber, and so all of this slag was just building up on top of itself inside of the boiler. And then in the water chamber, completely unconnected from the issue in the boiler, the slag that had fallen into the water chamber, that had cooled and settled at the bottom, it had landed in such a way that it actually blocked the grinding mechanism. And so none of the cooled slag boulders and rocks were being ground up and expelled out the other side. And so they needed to fix these 2 issues quickly, otherwise Unit 2 would become basically ineffective. Now, the safe way to fix these 2 blockages would be to start by turning off Unit 2's boiler. And then once it was off, you could drop dynamite into the boiler itself and break up the blockage over the man-sized hole, and you could send a team into the water chamber after you drained it to chip away and move the blockage over the grinding mechanism. However, Turning a boiler off at a power plant is extremely expensive. And so the Tampa Electric Company decided, you know what? Let's just have them fix these blockages without turning the boiler off. And so at 4 in the afternoon, a senior plant manager rounded up 5 other employees, which included Antonio, to come with him and do these repairs inside of Unit 2. And so the plan was to empty all the water from the cooling chamber of Unit 2, and then once it was empty, they would open something called the doghouse door, which is on the outside of the cooling chamber towards the bottom. They would open that up, giving them a line of sight into the bottom of this cooling chamber where that grinding mechanism was, where all those slag rocks had kind of come to a stop on top of it, and they would fire water cannons into the bottom of this cooling chamber to attempt to dislodge these slag rocks off of the grinding mechanism. And then after they cleared that blockage, they would shut the doghouse door and they would somehow deal with the blockage inside of the boiler. But that felt like a secondary issue. They needed to make sure the grinding mechanism was cleared before they did anything else. Now, you need to understand that this company had asked their employees to do this type of repair before, to do it with the boiler still on, and in the past, nothing bad had ever happened. And so these 6 guys, including Antonio, must have thought this was just totally routine, that we would never be asked to do something like this if it was extremely hazardous. But it would turn out what they were doing, making these repairs with the boiler still on, was quite possibly the most hazardous thing they could possibly do at this plant. But either way, the 6-man team made their way over to Unit 2, and they began taking up positions with their water cannons right in front of the doghouse door. Antonio's job for this operation was actually not to be involved in getting the slag free. He was just going to be there to clean up during and after the operation. And so he stood kind of in front of the doghouse door, but maybe 10 or 15 feet back, just kind of standing back, watching the other guys do their jobs. Now, you need to understand the scale of the machinery in front of Antonio and these other men. You have the water chamber, which is 30 feet tall, and then above the water chamber is the 12-story tall boiler that is still on. So there's coal actively burning inside of it. There's red hot slag, so like lava, just kind of tumbling around inside of it. And the steam inside of this boiler is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they are dwarfed by this totally dangerous piece of machinery. But eventually, their operation begins. The senior plant manager has the water chamber drained, and then after it's empty, they open the doghouse door, and Antonio watched as the other 5 men took turns with their water cannons, firing them through the store at the big slag rocks that are sitting on top of the grinding mechanism. And it wasn't really working that well, but they were starting to make some progress, and Antonio likely was just kind of getting bored, waiting for this to be over, because there really wasn't much for him to do. There wasn't much cleanup. And then as he's standing there, something horrible happened. Because the boiler had been left on, all that ash was still getting melted and turned into slag. And the slag was not being drained because that plug had formed over the man-sized hole in the boiler. And so you have all this slag that's building up. It's getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 20 minutes into their cleanup operation, the weight of all that slag broke through that plug, immediately creating an opening where all this red hot slag, this lava, came tumbling down. It rebounded on the back end of the empty water tank and shot out of the doghouse door like a tidal wave of hellfire. And in seconds, thousands of gallons of this lava-like substance was all over all 6 men. It was like a wave going over them. And then after the slag hits the ground, they were all standing in 6 inches of basically lava that stretched in 40 feet in any direction. Now, unlike trying to run in, let's say, mud or deep water where you're just kind of moving slowly, every step you take in this slag, basically your foot melts into the slag. So with every step, your shoe melts, then your skin melts, then your bones melt into this substance. And so all these men, after immediately being hit with this stuff and catching on fire, literally, they likely tried to start running, but it was like their bodies were slowly consumed by this slag feet first. And so Antonio tried to run like the rest of them, but he couldn't go anywhere, and he fell onto the slag. So he's laying on his side, and as he's melting and burning to death, he reaches into his pants his pocket with his free hand and he pulls his phone out and he calls his mother. She doesn't pick up, and so he leaves her a voicemail. And all he says is, "Mom, Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom." And in the background of this voicemail, all you hear is the hissing sound of the steam and slag pouring out of the boiler. In total, 5 of the 6 men that were a part of this repair operation would be killed from this tidal wave of slag. Antonio would be one of them. Tampa Electric would end up paying out a settlement to each of the families of the deceased.